Okay. I'm not exactly sure what the issue was there, but it appears to be resolved. So sorry, everybody, for all of that chaos in the first few minutes. I think we can try this again. And don't worry, Alan, this won't eat into your time for presenting the project. Anyway, my name is Stephen Hartman, and for the executive group, the interim executive group of Bridges, I'd like to welcome everybody back for this second day of the inaugural assembly of Bridges. Yesterday, we had discussions which became more and more interactive as the day went on, and I think yielded some really excellent dialogues towards the end of the day. And I expect that to be continuing today, and I also expect us to be moving more and more towards operational questions, but also questions of strategy and vision as we move on. So we'll both be addressing still a number of the big questions raised by the kinds of projects we're just going to hear from in a moment, but also the other potential projects and activities and work that Bridges is going to be working to promote. But as we move on, we will move towards a consensus decision on some key points to allow Bridges to be unfolding moving forward, and for us to have a structure to be working in actively. So I'm going to turn things over to Carlos now, who's the chair, or to Pedro, pardon me, now who's the chair of the first session. And I look forward to all of us joining in the discussion later.
Yes, good afternoon. We will have today in the program different sessions. We'll have a total, I think, of 7 sessions. But the first one will be a session that will make a presentation of one of the projects that has been endorsed by Bridges. Yesterday, we have 3 presentations. This will be the last one in terms of presentation of projects. And this is a project that is very interesting. And the title is Reviving Water in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia. And the initial presentation will be made by Alan Herrera from the Tayrona Heritage Trust. But we also have in the schedule of this session intervention by people who are key to this project, which is 2 persons representing the indigenous population that has been participating in the project. One is Arrecoses Conchacalaca Salabata, which is Koji Council governor, and the other person is Silvestre Gil Salabata, which is from the self-government coordinator of the Koji Malayo Arahuaco Indigenous Reservation, in which this project has been carried out. So having said that, please, Alan, you have the floor.
Okay, hi. Well, can you hear me all right? Yes? Good, okay. I'm now going to attempt to do a presentation using a PowerPoint, and screen sharing is always a slightly terrifying activity, but I will have a go at it and see if we can manage it. So forgive me if things go slightly awry, but I hope that this will be the start of the shared screen and that you can see it all right. And now I want to remove the picture of you guys to somewhere safe. Right. Oh, now I've lost how to move the slides around. Right. Okay, I've got that. Now you can see the picture on the screen. Right. So the Kogi people of Colombia, who we're talking about, have a word that includes the idea behind Bridges. It conveys the benefit that flows from cooperation and mutual support between people coming from different starting points. And that word is zigoneshi. They use it as a label on general documents produced to inform and work with the non-indigenous population that surrounds them. Now, they believe that 2 fundamentally different kinds of people were originally conceived on their unique, steep, isolated triangular mountain, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which they see as the origin place of all life. The first were their own ancestors, who were created as guardians of all life, to listen to instructions and correct imbalances. They are the elder brothers, and their knowledge keepers, called mamas, have a long and arduous training in how to understand and respond to the mountain's needs. Then there was a second creation of humans, their younger brothers, who didn't feel that responsibility and just took whatever they wanted. Our ancestors, who were too dangerous to be allowed to remain. They were given knowledge of machines and sent away to the far side of the sea. And 500 years ago, they came back. They recommenced the plunder, looting land, gold, minerals, whatever would enrich them. The Sierra's indigenous survivors of that conquest, the remnant of the elder brothers, exist today as 4 groups, one of which we call Kogi. They call themselves Kagaba. They were driven further and further up the mountain, and their access to the sites where the mamas have to carry out their work of guardianship has been dramatically reduced. The lands they've lost are degraded and polluted, the natural springs vanishing, the rivers diminishing, the glaciers melt, the rainforest has no rain. The Sierra only receives 1/3 of the rain that it had 40 years ago. And without water, their villages burn in new fires. The 500,000 inhabitants of the old colonial city of Santa Marta at this mountain's foot now have to buy their water from trucks. The combination of global warming and massive wastage is making the region increasingly uninhabitable. The mamas have spoken of 2 possible futures. In one, younger brother's conquest reaches its final stage, the colonization of the whole Sierra. His knowledge of machines is not an understanding of nature, and when the mamas are finally gone, the world itself dies. This is, of course, the vision of an unsustainable civilization that we now see as an emergency. The alternative is that the conquest is halted and the 2 forms of knowledge are brought into the same space to work together. Zigoneshi, bridges. So the Mamas organization, Golovindua Tirona, began working with our NGO, the Tirona Heritage Trust, with Bridges oversight to plan a way to do this. We decided to make the focus a pilot project to begin the restoration of a badly damaged river valley with the object of achieving recovery of flora, fauna, and most fundamentally, fresh water. The Mamas work at sites called Ezwama, which they understand as places that are alive and provide essential sustenance to and communicate with other living locations to which they are linked by what the Kogi describe as threads. The fabric of the world is a dense weave of threads, analogous to nerves, veins, arteries. Some are physically manifest in surface water flows, some are underground flows in the paths of winds and clouds, some are revealed in the movements of animals and birds. Some are trains of thought, connections only graspable by people specially trained from birth, raised for 18 years in the dark. Is this graspable? They navigate through the world using a completely different set of coordinates from us, and hear it speak to them. In 2018, 2 mamas and a female authority called a saga and their translator Silvestre, who you will meet, came to the Drôme in France with a French NGO called Chendukwa to compare their way of knowing a landscape with ours. Kogi do not make visual images of any kind, but they were invited to show how the ideas within might be represented in visible form. What emerged was this representation of the invisible thought of the dynamic flow of water, air, and influence, which the Kogi perceived beneath the Drôme's illuminated skin. Particular sites, represented symbolically by appropriate shells, were identified as having a function and a mission, each linked to a type of ecosystem or species of animals or plants. They speak of the whole world being structured in this way. Then they helped with painting what they saw as the visible, illuminated trace of the ideas that shaped this landscape. Younger brother sees differently. The foot of the Sierra where the mountain rivers meet the warm Caribbean used to be shrouded in dense mangrove swamps. To open the land for development, Colombia built a coastal highway, slicing through the threads, tearing the fabric that they could not see. One of the world's largest mangrove forests became an immense graveyard of wooden stumps. The Kogi want us to understand that their work is based on deeper insight. The evidence supports them. Ancestrally, they were remarkably successful at land management. The population of the Sierra when the Spanish first arrived has recently been estimated at around 700,000. The river valleys were still well wooded in 1970. This was the Rio Ancho Valley. The green represents forest cover. 25 years later, it had been almost completely deforested. Today, the Sierra supports less than 1/10 of the pre-conquest population and requires a UN food assistance program. The systems in use for land management before the conquest were evidently much more effective than those available now. Their work, restoring degraded forest, rivers, and habitats in the foothills, achieves what ours cannot. One particular example is in the Huaychaca River Valley, which was devastated by lowland deforestation and inefficient farming, and then purchased by the indigenous people. The river had almost dried up, the animals had disappeared. Over 20 years, working at iswamas and sacred sites, they restored the forest, increased the river to a healthy volume, and saw the return of animal life. The new project for bridges aims to carry on such work in coordination with academics to allow for evaluation with public visibility, local education of non-Indigenous communities, and publication in academic journals, and of course, for natural sciences to support this work of recovery and conservation. The development of a defined pattern of work has been severely interrupted by the impact of COVID-19 in Colombia, which right now has around 20,000 new cases and 500 deaths a day. The governor of the OGT has died, and the Kogi have largely remained isolated in areas of the mountain where there are no roads or electricity. The new governor has been reviewing the proposal, he's here now, with us, and wants the project to be conducted by selected mamas at an aswama on degraded land purchased especially for the purpose. So it would start from scratch, and progress can be academically compared with photographic and other evidence taken from sites which have already been restored by mamas. He has recommended that the title of the project, which we had originally had as Nimungwi, needs changing because it has a magical non-scientific dimension. It has the implication in Kogian of water being reborn. Revitalizing, yes, but the Kogi do not claim to give birth to water. Under the mama's eye, the water returns naturally and the land heals itself. Munikan Masha, the land is revitalized. Progress towards defining the location, personnel, and budget is made cumbersome by the difficulties of physical and conceptual communication. It can take weeks for a single question and answer to travel between our worlds with everyone understanding and in agreement. It should help that we've provided OGT at their request with the funds to expand internet communication. This is a very challenging project, and it's fundamentally important that the OGT takes the lead role. The development of the project will be designed with them to fit academic reporting protocols. The project aims not only to serve as a demonstration of what can be achieved by the partnership of two fundamentally different forms of knowledge, but also as a demonstration of the importance of the restoration of ancestral lands to the Kogi for the welfare of everyone in the region and the world. The best future, rather than the worst. So that's the presentation, and I now hand you over to the Kogi. Pedro, do you wish to introduce them? I don't know where they are. Are they there?
Okay. Okay. I see it's Parra is there. Parra, right? I have here that Parra White. We provided the translation.
Is Folk there?
Yeah.
Well, Folk is who you want.
Folk is not here online yet. So maybe
he was
maybe,
here earlier.
I know.
Yeah.
Hello.
Okay.
I couldn't unmute myself. Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. All right. Here we go. So here's hello everyone.
Please go ahead, please.
So here's Silvestre. He's going to speak now on behalf of the Kogi.
Buenos días.
Good morning.
Alan.
Hola.
Steven. ¿Quién más? John. Luis. Y los demás organizaciones que están presentes a este evento. Es muy importante que ayer estuvimos escuchando de varios temas de organizaciones que se presentó. Es muy interesante también. Y nosotros acá, el pueblo Coyi de la Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta en Colombia, había 3 departamentos, Cesar, Guajira, Magdalena. Estamos en la sierra, es una cultura muy importante. Nuestra organización se llama Organización Gonawindúa Tairona.
So he's greeting everyone, all participating organizations. He likes to thank you for this invitation. He was listening to everything that was said yesterday. He thinks it's all very important. And he is now introducing his people, the Kogi people, who are from the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta mountain range. They live in 3 states, split across that mountain. And he's now introducing their indigenous organization, their political representative organization, which is called Organización Gonawindúa Tairona.
Esa organización Gonawindúa Tairona fue fundada para defender el principio de territorio, para defender el principio de cultura, para defensa del principio de agua, para defensa del principio de cerros, bosques, mar y objetos sagrados que están alrededor del territorio y el mundo.
So their organization was established in order to defend and safeguard all the existential principles, the principles of life that govern the land, the culture, the water, the forests, and all things that are underground, all objects that are underground in the land.
La razón de los mamos se ha plasmado esos conocimientos que todavía estamos manejando. Por eso mismo nosotros acordamos el tema de rehabilitación de las naturalezas, el agua, aire, fuego, tierra, alimentos, también cultura y conocimientos, que eso hay que mantener, que eso hay que cuidar, que eso hay que proteger, hay que conservar.
Okay, so he says to this day, they are still following those principles of life guided by their spiritual leaders, their knowledge experts called the Mamas, and they have all agreed to continue doing this now through their organization, to continue protecting those principles, all elements of life, the earth, the water, foodstuffs, and also to protect their knowledge, their customs, all together.
También la cultura Kogi es muy importante, que siempre hablamos el tema de la conservación, de protección, desde la parte alta hasta la parte baja, hasta el mar. También la parte espiritual y material. Son conocimientos que están plasmados, esos conocimientos ancestrales que está ordenado desde la ley de origen.
Okay, so in order to protect and maintain these structures of life, they do it as a whole, from the top of the mountain down to the bottom, and they see this mountain as an integrated whole, where all the traditions, the knowledge that with which they work and with which they protect the mountain is in the mountain itself, on the sites. And they protect everything both on a spiritual level and on a physical level.
Por eso mismo nosotros acá en la organización con los pueblos y los mayores de los Suama es un espacio muy importante que a través de los MAMOS fue consultado para seguir proyectando con el Bridges, con el UNESCO, que íbamos a trabajar para que también con los hermanitos nos pueda también apoyar para consolidar el territorio. Por eso hace parte para fortalecer nuestro principio del gobierno propios, para fortalecer la de Kualama, es vivir sano en el territorio, en los espacios. Entonces hay muchos espacios sagrados que están fuera de recuerdos, pero siendo dentro de línea negra, necesitamos para poder recuperar esos espacios. Cuando se recupera esos espacios sagrados, ya también para poder seguir recuperando nuestro conocimiento, el agua, regeneración de bosques y los animales que también
so, as I was saying, he's making clear that the Sierra is a network of sacred sites, and there's particular sacred sites, spaces that are very important for the traditions where the Mamas work. And from there, from those sites, from discussions there, from those traditions that happen there, they have agreed to work with Bridges, with the younger brother outside, in order to receive the necessary support to continue protecting these principles of life, this whole territorial framework. Yes.
Entonces, al recuperar esos espacios, también tiene esas conexiones. Nosotros hablamos de las conexiones en la parte baja, media y alta, y también lo espiritual y lo material. Entonces, al recuperar ese espacio, ya se aumenta, humedales, aumenta el vapor, se aumenta en las nubes, se aumentan las especies animales, todo eso. Entonces, en la parte baja fueron muchos espacios que fue afectados del cultivo ilícitos. Entonces, en esas partes, pues, hoy en día se encuentra bastantes, ¿cómo dice? No se encuentra en bosques.
He's saying that the different levels of the mountain are all interconnected. They divided mainly into 3 zones, the upper, the middle, and the lower zone. At the lower zone is where most damage has been occurring by the younger brother, where all these developments, mining, etc., deforestation takes place. So in order to continue protecting the Sierra, in order to, or even restore it, it is fundamental to regain access to the lands below, to reincorporate them into the indigenous territory, officially into their territory, because without this land, they cannot carry out their practices which sustain nature. And once they have the land again, it can both regenerate itself and be regenerated through their practices, through what they call Kualama, which is the healing of the land, the continual regeneration of the land, and those are also their rituals. And so it is, once this happens, and based on their access to the land, then everything will start flourishing, will start regenerating itself, such as the clouds, such as the water, such as the animals, the plants, etc.
Entonces, como autoridades tradicionales, hemos acordado que nosotros también podemos ser parte de la UNESCO con Bridges, con la herencia tairona y la organización con la herencia tairona, para poder trabajar, transmitir ese mensaje, también para poder compartir ese diálogo de recuperación de esos espacios sagrados, que también para poder trabajar conjuntamente esos conocimientos que están guardados, también toca como visibilizar. Entonces, es muy importante que nosotros hemos hecho esos documentos. Antes era el mismo WIC, pero es la misma palabra, pero ya un poco más fundamentado como es Munekamashas. Eso quiere decir recuperar ese espacio sagrado y dejarte para regeneración de bosques, animales, para poder para poder ver esas naturales. Y también en la cultura, también el conocimiento, porque ahí está, el espacio está sembrado de ese principio, esos códigos que está ahí. Entonces también en esa parte, también la parte base necesita la sostenibilidad, digamos tanto por ciento de sostenibilidad y tanto por ciento para regeneración de bosques, para seguir compartiendo con naturalezas, tanto persona y ella, porque nosotros estamos hablando el corazón de la madre tierra. Entonces somos parte de ellas, todos somos hijos, como dicen los mayores, hijos de ellas. Por eso vamos a seguir ayudándolos, mejorando a nivel sierra y a nivel mundial.
Mamas and situationists, in order to also engage in this dialogue, in this knowledge exchange, in this process of intercultural communication, in order to establish and discuss the necessary measures, agreements, etc., to carry out this or to continue this safeguarding of the land, of nature as a whole, in order to regenerate it both naturally and culturally. He says that the principles of life that I was mentioning earlier, these codes, as they call them, these are certain, if you will, spiritual or energetic forces in the land. These, both culture and nature, depend on those forces in the land. And the knowledge that they have, the knowledge that they employ to sustain the land is also in those places. And so that's everything what they would like to regenerate, so that he's stressing that the recovery and the maintenance of the land is at the same time the maintenance of their society. And so in order to do this, they would like to engage in this dialogue, in this conversation, and find the mechanisms to carry this out. Finally, just to finalize, says that we do this, the land is a mother, it's the mother, and we're all children. So we want to collaborate as children who understand themselves and care of their mother.
One question, do we have an additional presentation, or it's just this one?
No, this is the follow-up to the first presentation.
No, I know, but I mean, there is a second person from the Koji community that will speak, or is the only one?
Balk?
No.
Sorry, can you say that again? I didn't...
Ya, ¿es la única persona Koji que va a hablar o hay otra persona adicional?
Sí. La única persona Koji, sí, correcto.
Okay, because I think that given that we are we have like 10 more minutes, maybe it would be very useful to use the remaining time that we have allocated to allow people to make comments and questions to this very interesting case. So if you agree, I will invite all participants to raise your hands and please ask questions, make comments, suggestions, whatever. So please, you have the floor.
He would like to just add one thing, 1 minute. Is that possible?
Sure.
Before we go into the question?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, please.
Era para preguntar, Bridges y UNESCO, con toda esta propuesta que nosotros tenemos para que el Bridges pueda estudiar y con el UNESCO, esos documentos que ya están formulados, varias propuestas que tenemos, la caracterización, identificación de los espacios sagrados. Entonces, eso se amerita esos apoyos de la organización. Entonces, ¿cómo se va a hacer? ¿Nos van a apoyar esas organizaciones? ¿Cómo vamos a seguir trabajando conjuntamente? Porque el problema del territorio busca para que alguien nos pueda apoyar para el recuperación de espacios. Si no hay tierra, no hay generación de aguas ni nada. Si hay tierra, va a haber las lenguas, la cultura, el conocimiento. Entonces, en esta parte, ¿cómo nos va a apoyar para seguir trabajando en la igualdad? Estos temas. Esa es la pregunta ahorita, para saber ahorita, ¿sí?
Okay, so he just wanted to finish with a question. A doubt they've had, which is that given how we're coming together, how this is being established, the Bridges Coalition, and how they are part of it, and how we're building an agreement, and we have presented a project and so on. He's wondering two things, basically. First of all, how participating institutions or Bridges as such can support the Kogi in the things that he's been saying in the recovery of their territory, specifically regaining access to the sites, to the land. And conversely, he's wondering in which way will the Kogi be participating, will be contributing to the development of Bridges, to further conversations and activities. They're just wondering how that's going to work, in which way they can be involved. So that's what we wanted to finish with.
Excellent. Thank you. I think this is a very important. This is a very important question, and I hope that maybe as part of the exchange that we will have now, we'll have some ideas, comments on this point. I noticed that Paul Chivastava has wants to intervene. Please, Paul.
Hi, I want to say thank you very much for a really excellent presentation. These are exactly the kind of projects that need to be done. I consider this to be sort of a ground zero project where climate change is impacting indigenous lands and lives, and the project's ambitions are very much in line with the kind of recovery and regeneration that Bridges wants to see. So I want to applaud the entire team for doing the work and for sharing it with us today. My question is really not just to the team, but to all of us who are gathered in this General Assembly. It seems to me from what I've heard that the primary interventions that are needed for land reformation or returning land control back to the indigenous groups would have to be legal interventions and political interventions. This group, this General Assembly membership, is largely consisting of academics representing institutions from around the world. So what is it that academics are willing to do? How much are we willing to step into the legal and political intervention domains is something that we need to sort out, because I think many projects will have this at the intersection. Are we going to continue to do academic work and publish in academic journals? Or are we going to make political and legal and other on the ground interventions that seem to be called for by this presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Other question, comments? Yeah, Steve, please.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'd like to just follow up on Paul's question to ask what benefit having UNESCO's endorsement and having the Bridges Coalition closely aligned with the Management of Social Transformations program can do as far as creating connections diplomatically through the UNESCO organization that would enable Bridges to be working together with the members of the project that are now a Bridges endorsed project. So I want to put this question out there more generally and invite, if possible, some intervention from UNESCO on what possibilities there may be for cooperation that go beyond the traditional academic.
Yes. I don't know if John is there. If John wants to intervene.
Yes, I am, Pedro. Probably it's for me to answer that question. It's not an easy question to answer because the issues are obviously not within the prerogative of the Secretariat to resolve. But what the endorsement of Bridges as a MOST coalition provides is a recurrent structured space for exchange with UNESCO's intergovernmental mechanisms through the Intergovernmental Council of the program. And to be specific, the Intergovernmental Council will next meet in extraordinary session in early December 2021, which provides a clear moment at which the normal process of reporting on what Bridges has done can create the conditions for a conversation about how the more political or administrative aspects of projects connected to Bridges can be pursued. This is, again, something that the Secretariat doesn't control. It can only create the conditions and manage the process, but it opens that space and does it in a formal and clearly recognized way, and thereby open space. However, I think there are other angles to be pursued as well, with respect to which endorsement by MOST may be valuable. One angle clearly is the connection with the Man on the Biosphere program, since the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta is a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. I know that these are tricky issues. There are complicated specific mechanisms which have nothing to do with MOST with respect to how MAB manages its reserves, but it creates the connection and opens the possibility of dialogue. And of course, as the social and human science sector for UNESCO, we strongly welcome the fact that our colleagues from the natural science sector are directly implicated in this effort. And thirdly, many of these issues are issues that can only be resolved at national level. And at the national level too, endorsement as a MOST coalition provides an entry point, but only an entry point. It doesn't resolve issues. It just makes it possible to explore them. For instance, with the relevant authorities of Colombia, including in particular the UNESCO National Commission. So making this work will not be easy because we're starting from scratch in that respect. Indeed, Colombia is not currently a member of the MOST Intergovernmental Council, which only has 35 members, but it creates the possibility of dialogue. I think we should be both ambitious in terms of what we want to achieve and quite modest in terms of how fast things can be achieved. Let's build steadily, slowly, keeping in mind that the next formal opportunity to explore these kinds of issues will be the extraordinary session of the IGC, which doesn't have a firm date yet, but has been set by the session of the IGC in March in early December, first days of December. Sorry, that answer sounds a bit vague, perhaps even slightly evasive, but that's what we can do at this stage.
Yes, please. Other comment, questions? Not seeing. Oh, Lucy Atala. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. So I really wanted to attend to the first point said by Paul rather than John's point. And I think in terms of this case specifically, so I'm part of the Tayrona Heritage Trust, so I've been part of developing the proposal with the rest of the group, that the aim, part of the aim, as I see it, is to disseminate educational material from the lowest stages of education up, so that a change in attitude to knowledge, what knowledge is, and how to understand human interactions with the environment becomes something that's situated in curricula from the earliest of ages, in which then different knowledges sit alongside each other, not one taking precedence necessarily, to show the complexities and the differences associated with understanding our world. And that doesn't create a hierarchy of knowledge, which currently stands in a way that the knowledge that's come out of the global north takes precedence over perhaps other small-scale cultures, typically in the global south. And so part of the point of this in terms of impact and output is dissemination of easily accessible educational materials, and not just describe what other people do, but show how what other people do actually works. And that attends slightly to Petra's point in the chat about presenting compelling evidence of indigenous understandings of the world as being not just rather nice, but absolutely accurate and useful in moving into the future, so that things are, actions are more sustainable, and think about the future in that way. So my hope is that these Bridges projects attend to education at every level. So that's about policy, and that's about governments, and that is political, not ideological, I hasten to add, but political in the sense that people will be learning from the youngest of ages that there are different ways to approach the world, and that nature isn't outside somewhere else, but rather is part of flowing through existence. So that's what I wanted to say.
Sorry, another question? Other comments? Okay.
Pedro, can I, can I jump in with a response, because there's some stuff going on in chat that deserves to be brought into the conversation, particularly, now I understand, I mean, I agree with the chat contribution that there are many ways in which we can augment and help and bring it to our own curricula, whether at young ages, or bring it to the attention of political leadership and create some consensus in the big decision making. But if you look at the chat, the expectations of the project people are very concrete. They historically, land has been acquired by purchasing from farmers or whatever, and they have actually some numbers put in over there. And this gives me the sense that this sort of an expectation, are we addressing this type of expectation in what we are doing as bridges? Because otherwise we can appropriate knowledge from the indigenous people and teach our young children about how to look at the world differently. But that doesn't help them directly in what the project is attempting to accomplish. So I want to push this further, because I go to too many meetings in which we come with very good intentions about providing academic knowledge, but here the issue is reversed. We are gaining knowledge from the indigenous worldview and not even acknowledging that as yet. So, and we need to be able to repatriate some kind of service or resource or good so that this is a mutually beneficial relationship. I'd like for our General Assembly to think about that for a second and see how we do things differently in these projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question, comments? Okay, I think we are about to finish, but before that, I just want to go back to the...
Hello? Pedro?
Yes?
If possible, the Kogi Council...
Yes? Oh, Manuel.
He's a busy person, so that's why he could make it to the...
Yes, go ahead.
Buenos días.
Dios amigos es.
A ver, quiero aportar un mensaje de las sierras, de los mamos. Un saludo grande a Alan y los compañeros suyos. Buenos. Creo que el pueblo Kogi, el mensaje grande es, creo que es el cuidado del territorio ancestral. La estrategia del pueblo Kogi sin territorio no es nada. Sin sitio sagrado no es nada. Creo que la película de la herencia Taironas, creo que un mensaje grande para seguir recuperando a los sitios sagrados. Entonces, creo que el mensaje del pueblo Kogi está claro. El territorio es el integral del conocimiento, de la educación y la salud tradicional y la educación cultural y la soberanía alimentaria están bajo de los sitios sagrados. Entonces, creo que es el gran mensaje desde que fundaron la organización Gonavindua, la estrategia era recuperar el territorio ancestral. Creo que hemos venido recuperando el territorio y los sitios sagrados en la línea negra y la diversidad. y cuidar y conservar. Entonces, pues creo que nosotros acá creo que el proyecto que se llamó el proyecto Nimungwe, y ahora el proyecto le dimos el título, o sea, Munekan, así. O sea, Munekan Masha, la palabra Munekan es que solito nazca. Masha es dejarlas, o sea, dejarlas que ella solo se regenera. Entonces, ella solo se regenera, pero apoyados de los mismos trabajos ceremoniales, apoyan para que se dé naturalmente, se revivas a la diversidad, se regeneres. Entonces, pues creo que esas son el mensajes del pueblo Kogis. Entonces, quiero ser concreto. El concreto es el defensa, la casa grande, es el territorio ancestral, es la casa grandes, con todo el corredores, líneas negras y el mar. Creo que ese es nuestros sueños. Entonces, lo que quiero dejarlos, decirlos, creo que más es el mensaje es la estrategia es recuperar el territorio ancestral, y en eso es lo que nosotros manifestamos a los otros. Quien quiere aportar, pues aporten en esos. Creo que allí estaríamos hablando integral sobre la educación propias, la medicina tradición propias, la seguridad alimentarias propias. Todo se incluye allí con el sitio sagrados, y pues creo que hoy hemos ganado en la línea negra, el decreto 1500 de la línea negras, hemos ganado. Hoy necesitamos la implementación, o sea, la implementación. Con el gobierno nacional ya hemos hecho el plan manejo de la Sierra Nevada, el Parque Nacional, hemos trabajado. Entonces hoy estamos gestionando para la implementación a esos. Entonces, pues, es lo que quiero simplemente, quiero como manifestarlos, y el mensaje es, creo que cada día nosotros aprendemos de ustedes y ustedes aprenden de nosotros. Nuestra educación ambiental no es de que nos enseñe, sino que la educación ambiental está desde el pensamiento, desde el niño, o desde cuando está todavía dentro de la mamá. Creo que la escuela nace cuando esté dentro de la mamá mismos. Entonces, pues creo que el mensaje creo que por eso la herencia tairona, la película, fue importante. El último, ¿cómo fue el último? El último también a Lunas, también aportamos. Creo que a Luna era un poco más que de todo el mundo partiéramos desde el pensamiento, el manejo del territorio, el manejo en todos. Entonces, pues creo que es lo que quería simplemente decir, y pues creo que más adelante continuaremos trabajando, ya no hay como presencial, pero trabajaremos, eso sí, en pensamiento, ya es, o sea, en el virtual de pensamiento estaríamos como trabajando. Entonces, pues creo que es lo que quería decir Alan y los más compañeros de ustedes y UNESCO. Y pues creo que el mensaje grande es la lucha sobre recuperación de los sitios sagrados. Es la lucha. O sea, el pueblo no vamos a descansar, continuaremos para adelante y pues invitando todo el mundo aportes sobre aportes para la conservación de las naturalezas, y creo que la vida de la naturaleza hoy en día está como a punto de morir los ríos, los lagos grandes. Entonces creo que es nuestras tareas seguir avanzando en esos, y pues simplemente también los invito a ustedes, a UNESCO, es un poco por la voluntad seguir como construyendo en esos. Entonces, muchas gracias, y pues a pesar como es otro dialecto, es difícil de entenderlo, pero ya sabemos en el corazón qué es lo que nos estamos expresándonos. Entonces, muchas gracias.
Falk, we need a quick summary of what that said.
Yeah.
Yes. So he started by saying thanks for the invitation as well, greeting everyone.
Can you get closer to the mic? You're very soft.
Sorry?
Can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Better.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So he's saying basically the Kogi message is taking care of their ancestral territory, the Sierra Nevada. That's the message. He says that we, Kogi, without the land, without the sites, the sacred sites, we're nothing. Everything depends on that. Our knowledge, our education, our health, our food, everything depends on that. And this was transmitted in the film that was done with Tairona Heritage Trust called Aluna. Our organization, the Kogi organization, that's their purpose. Just like this is the message to the world, that is their purpose, to recover the ancestral territory and biodiversity and everything, taking into account the whole Sierra Nevada, which is delimited by a series of sacred sites that they call the Black Line. It surrounds it, and this defines their territory, and so everything within it they have to protect. They have now been thinking about the proper title for our project, adding a Kogi phrase, which is Mune Kang Masha, which is basically expresses the principle that nature needs to regenerate itself. We need to support nature in that process because nature has the capacity to regenerate itself. And this is part of their wider strategy. So he says, I want to be concrete. We want to let you know that our objective is the defense of the house, the whole house. The Sierra Nevada is like a house, and we have to take care of the whole house, not just of one bit here or there, from the top, from the glaciers to the sea. And this is our dream. Our dream is to recover the entirety of it. And so this is why we're also here. We would like people to support us in this objective, because it cannot be any other way. Everything is in those sites. We are now, we have developed an agreement. We have a legal agreement with the government that recognizes the entirety of this territory. And the next stage is to implement that agreement. So we also need support for that. And he says, we will continue supporting each other. We will continue this dialogue. And he says that environmental education is not mainly or not primarily something where I teach you something and you teach me something. He says that the basis of the origin of environmental education is in thought, in our thoughts. And this means that we carry it with us since we are born or before we are born in our mother's womb. And since the land is the mother as well, that's where it comes from. And so the film he was talking about that Tairona Heritage Trust produced, that was the idea, that to transmit the fact that environmental education, how we take care of the land, is a thing of thought. It's a spiritual thing.
We should stop there.
That, as I said, we will continue working together in this fight. He said this is a fight, and we will never let it go. We will always fight for the sites, for the land, And so this is why we invite everyone to support us in this respect, because nature is dying. And even though it's difficult to understand each other, we will continue talking. And even if it's not personally, we can still do it virtually like now, which for them means also in thought, we can continue thinking about all this. So thank you all.
Well, thanks so much. So with this, we will finish the panel. A big thanks for all the participants. A big thanks to our colleagues, to our friends from the COGI people. And now I pass the floor to Stephen, who will be moderating the second session, which is a roundtable. Over to you, Stephen.
Okay, thanks very much. And thank you for a great intervention from the COGI, as well as from Alan and the team at Tayrona Heritage Trust in that last session. We're a little behind schedule now, but I think that these conversations are extremely important to have. And obviously, they raise questions, a whole bunch of questions, which I think will be part of an ongoing dialogue that Bridges has to be working to address. I don't think we're going to come up with optimal answers or solutions to a lot of these questions, even today, throughout the rest of the afternoon. This is a process, and it's one that I think that Bridges is very glad to be partnering with the COGI on and working with Tayrona Heritage Trust through the project to find ways of collaborating together and moving forward. I'd like to invite now the members of this panel will be a little shorter than we had anticipated originally. It's going to go about a half an hour now, maybe a couple of minutes longer. And this is a moderated discussion on how to better mobilize humanities knowledge and perspectives and local capacities for sustainability. And so I'd like to invite, is Eran Diantelli, the president of the ISC, here with us? I don't see him in the list. So I'd like to then invite John Crawley, Louise Osterbeck. John Crawley, of course, standing for UNESCO, Louise Osterbeck for SIPCH. Matthew Denis, if he can be here with us. I got a message from Matthew saying that he was multitasking. He had an urgent matter come up, so hopefully he can join us. Marcy Rockman from UNESCO-MOST, the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And Sandrine Payard from Future Earth, the French hub of Future Earth, to join us in this discussion. And I circulated a question to the colleagues in this panel to begin with, asking if we could address, from your experiences as a starting point, could you reflect a bit from your experience in your respective organizations where you feel humanities, arts, and or qualitative social sciences dimensions could make a meaningful difference in projects dealing with sustainability and sustainability science projects. And the same question could be asked about stronger community involvement and partnership in co-production of knowledge and efforts to achieve sustainable transformation in support of the SDGs, which is really how Bridges is positioning itself as a more complete and a more fully operationalized integrated approach that takes in some of those traditionally marginalized communities, voices, and even knowledge disciplines, academic disciplines that haven't been really at the center of that process. So I think I'd like to begin by directing this question first to Marcy, since we haven't heard from you really yet. And would you be willing to take that question on?
Thanks so much, Stephen. And yeah, I will do my best to reflect, and apologies, this will be a sort of thinking out loud, but I will do my best. So as Stephen has introduced me, I represent ICOMOS, International Council on Monuments and Sites, which is an international NGO that works for the preservation of heritage places. And as I briefly introduced yesterday, I currently wear the hat for ICOMOS of co-chairing an international co-sponsored meeting on culture, heritage, and climate change, which is working to take stock of the state of knowledge around the connections of culture, heritage, and climate change in collaboration within the IPCC system of reports. And I'll say one of the things that has really come to the forefront in this work that we're doing is that in our world and the world that ICOMOST lives in, heritage is seen in primarily its material aspects. It is this site, it is this place, it has measurable qualities. And one of the things that we lack and that we're struggling constantly to build are the intangible qualities around it. And the best way I can think to really explain this to you and bring all these pieces together is to actually give you a little bit more information that comes from other work that I've done that has brought me to ICOMOST. And that's my work with the US federal government in bringing together cultural heritage and climate change. We've just all heard from the Kogi and their incredible experiences and passion for the place in which they live, which is so critical. One of the things that I have seen in my work with the US government, and I'm now seeing with ICOMOST, is that the non-Indigenous communities struggle to convey their own love of place. And this is coming through particularly, and I've seen it most recently in issues with climate-related migration and relocation. In the climate world, it is, if anything is recognized, it is recognized that Indigenous peoples have history and heritage and connection to place, which absolutely they do. That is so fundamental. The balance of that is, however, is that non-Indigenous communities are not recognized as having any history or heritage or connection to place. And I've had the chance to work with a number of researchers who are in the space of what's called managed relocation and sort of the buying out of homes that are in floodplains and so forth. And I've had the chance to ask them directly, said, in the conversations that you've had with survivors, people who left New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, the New York City area after our Superstorm Sandy, I said, do you hear about people saying, I've lost my home, I've lost my place? Does that come up? Or is it more mortgage values and I've lost my home value in my bank account? And one of the researchers, particularly that I've worked most closely with, she said, oh my God, thank you for asking that, because it's there. She said, she also hears Indigenous peoples talk about their loss of place, and particularly examples in the US come from Louisiana with the Ile de Jean Charles, a group of Indians that are being relocated, and our Native Alaskans who are able to say, we are losing our culture, we are losing our home. So the people in Staten Island around New York, they don't have the same language for it. And it's not possible for them to really say they're losing their culture because they are staying within broader Western culture. She said, but they do say they are losing place in the words that they have. And one of the things that I see so much need for in social science and humanities is to try to give voice to that need and to that space for connection. And just last week, I had the chance to speak with the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which is working on figuring out how to implement new environmental regulations or existing environmental regulations that were changed by the previous US administration, and how do we live within them. And I was trying to explain to them that environmental justice has this deep heritage component to it. And the person I was speaking to, he listened, but he said, but most people in the US, they haven't lived where they are long enough for that to be heritage. So why does that even matter? And so I wanted to just share that with you, that the more that social sciences and humanities can give voice to the meanings of place for all communities, and recognizing that however long anyone has been in a place, they can care about it and they can be connected to those stories. And that helps us speak along with the Kogi and not in opposition to it. That was a long response, but that's something I did want to share. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Marcy. And I think that I'm going to redirect right to Matthew, because I'm glad to see him here. and then we'll move on, and then we'll, towards the end of the session, welcome some questions from the General Assembly.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, thank you, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Mathieu Denis from the International Science Council. It's very good to see again some old friends. Stephen, I wanted to take on the first question you raised, which is about, where do we see the possibilities for greater involvement of what you call the humanities, the arts, qualitative social sciences? And I want to make just one reflection based on my experience working for an organization that has actually brought together or brings together as its membership the big disciplinary unions and associations from the natural sciences to the social sciences and a good number of humanities organizations as well. To just highlight that in our interactions with different UN bodies, in our interactions with different other international science organizations, the big need, the big ask that I see emerging all the time and constantly is indeed for social sciences and humanities. So when it comes to global challenges today, dealing with climate change, Marcy just mentioned that, food, resilient food system, the redesign of food system, COVID is a good case in point, and all of the other global challenges, the one big need that I see constantly rearticulated in different ways is around greater involvement, direct participation of social scientists, qualitative, quantitative, whatever, social sciences from across the board, and humanities, and possibly arts. I mean, there's also, there's also an ask for arts. So there's no question in my mind, and that's the message I want to convey, that there is an opening, an interest, and therefore a need to organize ourselves to be able to contribute to addressing global challenges and providing, as part of our joint endeavor, providing strong social science and humanities voices in those processes. I mean, for COVID, we're dealing with a lot of different projects around COVID. Constantly, our understandings of health. What does it mean in different cultures, to be healthy or to be sick? Our understandings of death, what constitutes a community, and therefore who should we unite and work with? What is the role of rumors? What is the role of fears? All these things for COVID are central. They are being discussed, but not always by people who actually know and have studied those things and have something meaningful to say about those things. And so I think it is critically important indeed, bridges, that we use bridges, bring together that knowledge, and that we try and be much more present in in the big responses, the big initiatives, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary initiatives, and bring the humanities in those processes. That's essentially what I wanted to say. Back to you, Stephen.
Okay, thanks very much. And if I could just ask one quick follow-up, I mean, do you then see bridges as potentially fulfilling a role as a focal point for helping to facilitate these kinds of requests for more humanities engagement?
So yeah, I mean, for me, and I think between the ISC and UNESCO, I think indeed this is something that we can do. To turn to bridges and be the relay to those processes indeed, and work closely with you. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much. And I want to move right along to Sandrine. Welcome. Sandrine is the director of the French Global Hub of Future Earth, and is in the global executive of the Secretariat of Future Earth. So, Sandrine, what are your thoughts about this question that we've been discussing here in the first couple of minutes?
Hi, everyone. So I need to give a little bit of background about Futures. Futures is an international research program on global sustainability. Its main goals are to foster international cooperation, to support interdisciplinarity, and also more interactions between researchers and societal actors. Because of its history, the program has been dominated by natural scientists, even though we have social scientists and scientists from the humanities in the program, but it's still a program dominated by natural sciences. And the program, which was created in 2015, has evolved in the last years from a focus on global environmental change to a focus on sustainability science, at least in terms of how the program is presents itself. And this evolution has made the lack of social science and the humanities more and more problematic, I would say, and we really need to fix this. And that's why I'm very interested in being engaged in bridges. So to me, there are two key areas where more engagement with social science and the humanities would make a huge difference for Futures. The first point is that sustainability science is a lot about societal transformations, and it's basically impossible for the program, for Futures, to address this dimension without a strong engagement of social sciences and the humanities. The second problem is a lack of understanding within the Futures community and also within the governance of the program of the normative dimension of sustainability science. Actually, sustainability is a very normative concept. It involves ethical and social values, cultural norms, conflicting sustainable development agendas. And here again, you can't really develop a strong sustainability science without making values, norms, power relations central objects of research. This is also, this lack of engagement with social science and the humanities also, I think, explain that we are often struggling with engaging with societal actors. For me, more engagement with societal actors in the Futures program would require, firstly, to improve the capacities in terms of methodologies and approaches for co-production of knowledge. And I don't think you can do that without social sciences and the humanities to improve this capacity in the program. A second problem is the emphasis within the program on global approaches, because these approaches are more successful with funders, more successful in terms of impact factors, and so on. And of course, it's difficult to engage with societal actors at the global level. It makes full sense only in concrete context. The third problem, I think, here is also related to the lack of understanding of the normative dimension of sustainability. The idea that science should and can separate facts from values is still very dominant in our community. I think our scientists and the governance of the program, they understand that we need to interact more with societal actors to better know their needs. More and more, we also understand that actors are holders of knowledge and that we need to mix different kinds of knowledge. But it's still a strange idea, I think, for many natural scientists, that they need to understand the plurality of values that shape visions for more desirable futures. And of course, defining a more desirable future is at the core of sustainability science.
Thank you for those observations. These are all really valuable, and I think we'll almost certainly be hearing more from our remaining speakers addressing some of these issues. I'd like to turn to John Crawley for a UNESCO, or the UNESCO Social and Human Sciences sector perspective in particular, and then we'll go to Luis.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. And thanks, Marcy, Mathieu, Sandrine, in that order, for comments with which I totally agree. So I'll just find some way of giving the impression of saying something different while actually repeating everything that you said. I think it all boils down to one word, which was implicit in what you all said, but I think not explicit. So it gives me a hook, which is the word meaning. We have sciences that can study the structural systemic dynamics of things, and they are indispensable. But at the same time, everything they study acquires meaning and exists in part through the meanings it acquires, as all three of you said in various ways with various examples. And it just so happens that the disciplines that, since their invention, have been particularly concerned with analyzing patterns of meanings and also creating patterns of meanings have been precisely the disciplines of the humanities. And I emphasize both analyzing and creating, because one of the interesting features of the humanities, particularly, of course, the linguistic and artistic disciplines, but this is also true to a non-trivial extent in philosophy as well, and perhaps even in some parts of history, is concerned not just with looking at how things are done, but also with doing them. Art history connects to artistic creation. Musicology is not cordoned off from writing and performing music. Theorizing dance and dancing are not entirely separate activities, and so on. And indeed, in the academic university departments that deal with such things, often the connection is close and even personal, because the same people might be engaged at different moments in creating new art and equipping students with the tools for critical analysis of pre-existing art. I didn't even mention writing, which is perhaps the most obvious example of this. So I don't want to set up any rigid barriers between the humanities and the social sciences in this respect, because many of the social sciences also do this. Is anthropology a humanities discipline or a social science? It depends on the country. It depends on traditional modes of academic organization. For historical reasons, history in France is perceived more as a social science, whereas in the UK, for instance, history is perceived as part of the humanities, even though the historians might be doing more or less exactly the same thing. So we should be sensitive to the slightly arbitrary nature of these distinctions. But still, as all three of you have emphasized very clearly, there are some gaps here. And the gaps are about, first of all, deploying what's specific about the humanities disciplines on issues of sustainability, broadly understood, through the filter of meanings that exist and need to be understood, meanings that need to be created in order to shape possible futures, and at the same time connect those specific humanities approaches to approaches from other disciplines, which are complementary and not in opposition, with the dream, which after all is written into the founding principles of Bridges and connects very closely to the objectives of Future Earth as well, for instance, and things the ISC has been doing for a long time, or taken over from the ISSC, like the Transformations to Sustainability program, which is creating a genuinely transdisciplinary scientific approach, which is both a science of sustainability, which understands the challenges and dynamics and patterns of meaning and so on, and a science for sustainability that contributes to the social conditions where sustainability can be achieved. So I think all of this at the conceptual and methodological level is really a consensus among us, and perhaps also with many people who don't happen to be in this particular meeting. So we have a very solid base to move forward from. The question is what in practice we need to do to make that happen. And this is about bridges, but it's about more than bridges. And I'm sure Luis will refer in a moment when he intervenes to the European Humanities Conference and its outcome document, which is about this, not exclusively in the areas of concern to bridges, because it covers the humanities as a whole. But still, we need to answer important questions about what needs to be done to support better research in the humanities, access to humanities training, both for specialists, but perhaps equally importantly for non-specialists, how we need to create the conditions where humanities scholarship can be taken on board by policy communities in the same ways that it is taken for granted that, for instance, economics and behavioral psychology should be. If you want to resolve a problem, you call an economist. Maybe we need to create the conditions where you should be calling a philosopher and a literary scholar, and not simply assuming that doing so will be perhaps intellectually enjoyable, but a complete waste of time in practice. How to break those barriers? So I think maybe we should focus on that more than on the conceptual and methodological backdrop, which actually we agree on, it's there. The practical conditions for success, I'm not sure.
Okay. Thanks very much, John, for those valuable perspectives. And before I go over to Luis, I just want to say that we're going to go 10 more minutes in the session, and then I'll end it. And even if we haven't had a chance to address questions within the General Assembly in that time frame, the next session is totally devoted to questions from the General Assembly. So we will have an opportunity to follow through on any of the perspectives that were brought up in this session. Luis, could I turn to you now, please, for your perspectives from CIPS's point of view?
Thank you, Stephen. I was hearing to all of you, and I could see, in fact, a very strong convergence. This is great. And I could also understand that John is not an economist, because I have a very good Brazilian friend who is an economist, and he says something slightly different. He says, whenever you need to find a problem, bring in an economist. We will create the problem for you. But jokes apart, I think we got exactly as John said to the point where we understand. When I say we understand, I include everyone, in fact. I think that the pandemic, and even before, revealed to the majority of people who have to take decisions, not only for us, because for those who work in the humanities and so on, it's obvious, it's our job. But I mean, in a wider sense, there is an understanding that they can't do it alone, to put it in simple terms. But then it remains to see how can other things be done. The understanding we have in CIPS nowadays about what humanities are is quite wide if we want to frame it, because it has already been said, there are different understandings in what concerns disciplines. We see as part of the humanities everything that is related to not being limited to short-term driven solutions. So nothing against solutions, but we work in a different scale of time and space. And this is why we have people from mathematics and geoethics and natural sciences in CIPS nowadays. Now, if I would want to say something about the contribution of the humanities, I would start by saying one thing which is clear for all of us: it's not opposed to natural or social sciences or technology or other forms of knowledge, but it's different. And if one thing would immediately strike in discussion with other fields of knowledge, is that we don't essentialize anything or anyone. And this is very important, because when we talk about transformations, everyone talks about transformations. For example, the Green Deal is about transformations in the energy and so on. What is the problem with all these agendas, including the agenda of sustainability and the SDGs and so on, is that they set a series of targets on which they expect transformations to occur, but to a large extent, although this is not explicitly spoken, they assume that everything else will not change, will not be transformed. And in everything else, we must consider, first of all, the humans, the human clusters, the cultural traditions, and everything, the way we position each one of us in relation to others. So if we would think of contributions of the humanities, okay, there are some structural elements in it. You will not be able to do proper foresight without the humanities, because you can't do serious foresight. Of course, I could also add, you can't do any of these things without the social and natural sciences and other forms of knowledge. But specifically thinking of the humanities, if you don't have a depth understanding of time, which can only be provided through history, you can't really think of the future. This is almost an obvious thing. If you don't understand the procedures of knowledge transfer and building, which include dimensions of narrative and texts and critical analysis of texts, which is in the field of humanities, you can't do a proper job. The humanities, for example, stress the importance of conceptual diversity, on one hand as a strength, on the other hand as an inevitability. It means that for us it's very clear, people will never have exactly the same concepts because they have different languages, and languages are conceptual. This is why we stressed, and we have stressed in the European Humanities Conference, the importance of multilingualism. It's not only an issue of being sympathetic to linguistic diversity. It's because we don't want knowledge in terms of concepts to be lost. And we want conversation to be resilient in terms of its results. And to be resilient, it requires an understanding of this conceptual diversity, which relates to disciplines. Marcy was talking about this. And these are, let's say, the structural contributions. But then there are operational. And I think it is clearly operational. The fact that in the humanities, for example, we, through understanding that humans are at the core of any strategy, we have the tools, and of course there are theoretical discrepancies within the humanities as in any other field of knowledge, but we have the tools to bring together the sense of collective understandings and of singularities. It is the understanding of singularities, particularly in periods of transition, like we are experiencing now, that are very relevant. I'm not talking only about leadership, which is very well known in the field of social sciences, but I'm talking about innovation, for example. And so this I would say, it's one specific element that is absent in general strategic public policies. Where is the role of individuals? And then, of course, the strategies collapse because of individuals. We have the tools to bridge different communities of knowledge. This is, again, very important. The function of the humanities within the academic world is, to a large extent, that. This is why in the university, in the beginning, what we now call natural sciences were not taught. It was not because they were not important. It was not because no one was caring about that. It was simply because the first recognition for the need of a university was to keep the universal dimension of knowledge. And therefore, the initial disciplines related precisely to that. So we can do that across the different fields of academic knowledge, but also across other forms of knowledge, namely traditional knowledge. And today we have sound basis, not only in the humanities, but also in natural sciences. We heard the very important, I would say, conference of Antonio Damasio in the European Humanities Conference, also demonstrating how biologically we can understand these things today. For these reasons, we have another very important operational role. If you want to build trusts in society, which is a core problem in our society today, if we want to build trust, it will be through the methods of the humanities. Not only the humanities, but it is largely our role. Because as we engage everyone, as we bridge diversity with convergence, uniqueness with community, this creates room for trust. And creating room for trust is fundamental for co-construction of knowledge, which was one of your questions, Stephen, in the note you sent to us. To have co-construction, it doesn't mean to have first a professor of philosophy, then a professor of chemistry, and then a Koji person speaking. And then we are happy because everyone spoke. This is not co-construction. Co-construction is about learning the different languages and trying to build something together. And we've had this these 2 days. We've had it yesterday and we have it today because we are keen in learning. And then we will keep on reasoning in our own mindsets, but we will growingly incorporate the contributions and the thinking of the others. But to do that, the reason why the Koji are here today, it's not because we have allowed them to come. Because they are probably allowed to go in many places, but they will not go. As often we don't go. They came because they can trust on the others. All of us are here because we trust each other. And I think this is clearly a fundamental dimension of the humanities. Often people in the field of academic humanities simply don't go to some spaces because they think it's useless. And the same goes for the others, by the way. Colleagues in engineering and so on, if they find an assembly dominated by historians and anthropologists, they might say, oh, these people will talk and talk and they will never pay attention to my solution. So this is, I think, I'm getting to the end because the end is, are there examples where we could make the difference? Now, one thing very important, I think we have to take into consideration is that the reaction of people in face of the pandemic disconnected from institutions. And when we look at what people looked for example, in libraries, the rise of people looking for books on epidemics, historic books, not medicine books, but books from history and literature, shows, again, the central role people perceive in our function. If you think of the management of the pandemic, we would never, and there are good examples of management of the pandemic, although I think the global management is pretty bad, and it's pretty bad because the outcome of this management is a growing divide between believers and anti-science people, and this is bad. And the promotion of a superficial understanding of science and a superficial authoritarian understanding of why people should take the vaccine, and of course, by the way, I would say, please take the vaccine, but think about it and don't think that those that have doubts are criminals or stupid people, because they are not. They are also raising important issues. Humanities would not allow the discussion to be framed like this, and therefore we would not have, as an outcome of what I expect to be a control of the pandemic, a growing suspicion about science, and that is a disaster. Another example is the Green Deal. The Green Deal, Carlos said it yesterday, the Green Deal is, in the terms of the way it's presented, the new version of the exploitation of the planet. And therefore there is no transformative action, and the results will be bad if it stays like that. And the third observation and last is radicalism. What we do precisely by showing all the shadows, all the contradictions, all the other sides of each one's story is to prevent the exacerbation of radical discourse. And we all know where the radical discourse goes to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mention the results. Sorry, because John mentioned this. This is important. How to act in the end. Small steps, I would say. small steps. The European conference, I will not go into detail to that. I will put in the chat the documents, but all we think is small steps. For example, the Declaration of Lisbon, it simply says, everyone with a PhD should have a teaching about the integration of humanities and sciences. The way each one will do that, it's secondary. If everyone does that in 5 or 10 years, we will have a change in the approach of people to problems in society. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. And there are any number of really valuable perspectives that are brought up here. I'm delighted that the next session is going to be an open format for greater participation, questions and answers, and dialogue with the General Assembly. I'm not as good a strict timekeeper as you, Luis, because we went past 4 minutes, the 5-minute extension I had already granted us. So technically our next session is supposed to begin in 1 minute, but with everyone here's, with everyone's permission here, I think everybody deserves a few minutes break. So I'd like to suggest that we begin our new session, not at 1:45 as scheduled, but at 10:02 in 5 minutes. And let's take a break for now. Thank you everyone for your contributions.
Thanks, Stephen.
Hello, Margaret.
Mute. Start video. There we go. Okay. I've just printed out a few notes that I could use to get going. Hold on.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay, so I will be here to help Margaret facilitate this session by keeping track of hands raised. And I'm happy to turn this over to Margaret now.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. And I just am intensely grateful to all of the people who spoke earlier today, starting with the Kogi. And we have so much to talk about that I don't think we'll be able to finish until tomorrow, maybe, Stephen. So I thought I might start with just a simple reference to a concept that I think is pertinent to our issues about our living in and with our world as part of our world. And that is Locar's exchange principle. Every contact leaves a trace and picks one up. This is a concept used by lawyers in forensic medicine, but it also seems to me directly relevant to the complexity of our study of exchanges, translations, and contacts. One of the topics that I think came up repeatedly as highly significant for us and our work that we want to undertake. It was introduced by Bethany Wiggin in her presentation of My Climate Story. It's part of the Tyrona project, where the spokesman needed to narrate the project and who included two keywords, incluye, to include, and implementación, to implement. So storytelling is not just a way of embracing, but also a form of action that can head towards transformation. We also heard just now about heritage as a narrative about the physical, migration and loss. And Luis reminded us that we need to think about the multiplicity of stories, the many sides of stories and interpretations of stories. Translation, conversational models for communication between us, among us, and between the local and the global, and between us and the land, the physical world that, as I go back to Locar, the physical world that we touch and change in so doing. I could stop right there, although I'd like to pull in a couple of other terms. Translation is one of them. Our focus on language, how language fits into this picture, and how, just to expand the notion of what a narrative is, it's an instrument both of recognition and of communication. So I'll stop there and open up for questions and suggestions to follow up on the incredibly rich discussion we've already had today.
Okay, I see that Benno has raised his hand, so over to you, Benno. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm listening now for the second day, and the point for me that's not very clear is what is exactly the role of bridges? I learned from John before that it's a kind of endorsement of projects, but it will be handed over to the national funding agencies and other possibilities. Is that correct? And what would be the role then of bridges in the process with the funding agencies on the national level?
I'd be happy to jump in here just for a second, just to say that the endorsement scheme was started as a way of identifying in a pilot capacity demonstration projects and pilot projects that could be used to to demonstrate valuable approaches. And it is not seen as the sum total of what Bridges will attempt to do or wishes to do. But especially since Bridges at this stage and in the conception and visioning stage of the last 2 years, hasn't had any central resources. We've been using ad hoc resources to have the workshops and so forth. There's a limited amount that we could do. So that was one concrete effort that we felt that we could do and that we want to follow through on, and I think at a more ambitious scale. But it's not the only thing that we could do. And I think that that's partly what we've had as part of that visioning process. We had committees that were formed that produced internal reports on possibilities for development within education, within science, with communication, and in other areas, and in terms of social public interfaces that Bridges could strategically focus on. And I think that as Bridges gets operationalized, we need to turn to some of these ideas as well as further ideas that are being added to the mix with this now emerging inaugural founding consortium. So we don't have a single purpose, but we do have the purpose, I think, of helping to better connect the humanities, the arts, some of the qualitative social sciences, and societal partners who haven't found a place in sustainability science more effectively with the other major actors that are functioning at local and international scales within the scientific community and elsewhere in society. So we have a role that I think as part of this process will evolve.
So just, sorry, then just to come back to Paul's question yesterday. So Bridges is to understand somehow as a brand. Then if you are accepted by Bridges, then that means something like a UNESCO chair or something like that. It is endorsed by Bridges and UNESCO. Is that the point?
Yeah, so the Bridges endorsement, as we move into out of the sort of preliminary phase into the operational phase of Bridges, we're going to be collaborating with, for instance, the Scientific Advisory Committee of MOST and working out a mechanism for independent review of projects that are submitted to Bridges for Bridges endorsement, which would then imply an independent scientific assessment has taken place that for the purposes of quality assurance, that frankly can also be helpful to those projects in their own fundraising efforts. I think we have to look to a diversity of models for how we want to be able to get new work. There's not just a single way. And one of the ways is to help those projects that really have tremendous potential to receive the legitimacy and the help that they may need at national, local, and where possible, international levels through Bridges branding. So that's one thing Bridges will attempt to do.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Those were excellent questions. Do we have others?
Paul, I see Paul has raised his hand.
Hi, thank you. So the response that Steve, you gave about the purpose of Bridges, to me seems it's integration of social sciences, humanities, arts into the natural science. It's a very valid and viable purpose. But I'm worried that it's not sharp enough and that it is duplicative. I mean, if I see the progress of the International Science Council with the help of Denis and others, they are also attempting to integrate natural and social sciences. They've actually brought together the ISSC under the ISSC umbrella. And then Future Earth is also attempting to do the same kind of building sustainability sciences that are integrative of all these other sciences. So the intellectual project of integration across disciplines seems to be well on board with a number of secretariats addressing it at a global level. To add value, could we imagine Bridges not just as bridging these disciplines, but the primary focus being on action and delivery on the ground to the transformations that are in progress, delivery of knowledge, of resources, of political will, of legal advice, whatever else, but to specific projects on the ground. Because I hear this morning's presentation and I'm reflecting on that many things that were said in that. It's actually a very profound discussion that we had. And it seems to me that it is calling for science as a whole to step out of its comfort zone in orchestrating discourses to becoming instrumental in interventions. And I'm wondering whether Bridges could be the body that helps articulate what that could look like and bring some resources to it. Thank you.
I see three hands, Margaret. I'll just point them out to you. There are Luis, John, and then Benno again.
Yes, why don't we start with Luis?
Thank you, Margaret. I think these are very important questions. And I would start by saying that if we want to demonstrate that sustainability has an alternative to the dominant discourse, we really need a brand. It's not, I'm not saying that Bridges is only that, but I think that Bridges is precisely the label that, associated to UNESCO and to a large coalition of institutions, brings in a very diverse set of site-based initiatives, and that goes in the direction of what Paul was saying, initiatives that are diverse, are context-based, but do share an understanding of the global issues in stake. And therefore, they are all bridges, but they don't follow a sort of a menu that everyone has to follow. So it's an equilibrium. And again, I would argue this is the role of the humanities. This is why it's humanities driven, but it is not closed only to the humanities, because it can't be done with the natural and social science. It can't be done with traditional knowledge and so on and so forth. But the logic of integration on the basis of site-based projects is specifically our contribution. And in that respect, it's different. It's different from geoparks because it does not depend on the quality of natural issues, features in a territory. Although I think geoparks program is a nice program, but it has this limitation. It's not a world heritage because it is not limited. I loved actually the intervention of Marcy in the beginning of this afternoon, because often as we reduce everything to minorities, on one hand, we create the absurd idea that there is a majority, and on the other hand, we condemn this majority, which doesn't exist, to a sort of limbo. And I think Bridges, again, is the tool that can find room for anyone. So can you have it in a region which is completely devastated in terms of social inequity or in terms of environmental pollution? Yes, this is the novel thing. All the tools that we had so far, all the labels we had so far were anchored in the demonstration of good realities. Look at this good world heritage. Look at these good natural features. Look at this good paradise of biosphere. And this Bridges is not that. It's look at these people in action trying to build a different future in a logic of convergence, making the most of all the contributions. So the dream, if you wish, we must have is that we will and we are benefiting from the contributions of the COGI, as I'm sure the COGI are also benefiting from the contributions of other people in this room, from ISC, from different universities and so on. And that's it. And that's what society as a whole should do. And Bridges in that sense can act as a good demonstration, as I think all the other programs in UNESCO are that as well. Because in the end, World Heritage is is a program, is an utopia, is to tell people, look, there is an heritage which is the heritage of us all. It doesn't matter if it's in Brazil or in Bangladesh, it's a human heritage. And Bridges is saying, look, we can build this convergent future through our diversity, but it will still be one humanity in action. And of course, the moment we will win in any of these programs, everyone will understand that all the heritage is for all of us. The same, they will understand that all the planets is something we live with, in interaction with, because we are part of it. And if we win, we will have the principles of co-construction of governance everywhere.
Thank you, Luis. I think the next of the hands up was John Crowley.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm probably talking too much, but after all, there are reasons. UNESCO does have a role in this show. I think starting with Benno's question and the answers to it and the follow-up questions, there is a key issue which goes to the heart of this General Assembly and what it needs to produce. It's clear that there is a widely shared spirit which underpins Bridges, and I welcome that. It's clear that the various institutions that are committed to participate in Bridges because they want to and because it responds to their own strategic objectives will be doing things that will be valuable and share a common spirit, and we could meet periodically to exchange information about them. But I think it's important to assert that we've set up Bridges to be more than that. And this, I think, responds to Benno's question. We may not succeed, but the plan is for Bridges not just to be a kind of hub where a range of different contributions come together, but also to be a coalition that actually acts together in certain selected respects. Acts possibly to conduct specific projects, we'll see. For the moment, the projects have been designed to be implemented by particular member organizations, but in principle, that could evolve over time. Act to mobilize resources to support the efforts of individual members or the coalition as a whole. Act to communicate about what we're doing, including perhaps by producing specific reports, publications, documents, books, or whatever, films, or anything else, social media campaigns, and act together to shape policy agendas, which is one of the things that obviously UNESCO cares about particularly, whether at national or particularly international level. We don't have all the parameters and levers to ensure that ability to act jointly as Bridges, as a corporate entity, but the whole point of the formal endorsement by the MOST IGC, allowing us to have a kind of quasi collective personality, was to create the conditions where that might be possible, obviously, within the terms of reference defined by the General Assembly, and on the basis of the voluntary commitment of those who wish to commit. Not everything will be done by everyone. But as we proceed, there will be more things done by at least a number of Bridges organizations together. That's the idea. That's the strategic planning horizon. And maybe it's time to start thinking about how we could get there. Some comments have been made. Paul, for instance, emphasized action on the ground, and maybe that is the way to go. But you could also say, what kind of annual document do we need to produce as Bridges, which will be an agenda-setting contribution to international debate, which will allow us to be relevant, allow us to achieve certain direct results in terms of dissemination of ideas, and allow us to have a credible lever for resource mobilization. And it's not either or. You could pursue both paths and others in addition. So I don't want to exclude a purely bottom-up approach. There's a lot of virtue in that, and it's how we've got started. But let's also keep in mind that the whole point of creating all of these mechanisms is to equip us with the capacity collectively to design and implement some top-down initiatives. those that we decide collectively are relevant for the respective member organizations.
Yes, thank you, John. I think that highlights, among other things, the significance of our own communicative networking. I mean, I think of some of the projects we've been hearing about here as exemplary. And my own university, Connecticut, is very interested in developing its environmental heft and outreach. So one of the things I can and have been trying to do is to pass along in that context the examples that have already been developed. But that's an open-ended project. So it's actually a kind of expanding world that we're describing as a consequence of your vision, John, and Luis for that matter. So do we have other hands up? We had a question from Benno, is that right?
No, the chat has been very active, so I would like to encourage those people who are contributing perspectives and questions in the chat to raise your hand. This is a perfect time to be taking some of these up.
Petra, Sinan, I see.
Hello, thank you. Yes, I mean, I just put that into writing, but then as I was listening to you, I have this question in my mind, seeking ways of putting the existing and future and also potential bridges and doors projects in close dialogue with each other and encouraging authentic co-production in the spaces if and where they intersect, be a specific duty of bridges and a more tangible, perhaps, outcome of its role in, I mean, not just endorsing, but encouraging the endorsed projects to work together if and where possible and meaningful. That was just a suggestion, basically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sinan. Do we have Petra Gomersal, who wanted to respond to Luis or to John Cowley?
Yes, hello everyone. I haven't been, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Well, just to qualify myself at the beginning, I'm not an academic. I'm a trustee of the Tirana Heritage Foundation, and my position in these conversations is coming from the angle of the Kogi, where my understanding of their paradigm is very instinctive, and I'm very interested in influencing in the point that John raised, which is relating to the purpose of bridges and how we act together to influence policy agendas on a larger scale. And my question to him was whether we are able to implement our way of thinking, which is a lot more holistic, and bringing various disciplines and various paradigms into how policies are formed on much higher level in UNESCO, and whether he thinks that there is a specific goal or outcome that we could and not enforce but impact prior to the conversations about the midterm strategy for UNESCO.
Perhaps John should answer.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Petra. The answer, I put it in the chat, but let me repeat it, is definitely yes. Let me perhaps summarize very briefly the time frame for that. The Intergovernmental Council met in session at the end of March, in the same session at which Bridges was formally endorsed, and adopted a detailed timeline and process for the development of the new strategy, which will be formally adopted by the Intergovernmental Council in February 2022. And there are several steps between now and then. So we see the timeline is Bridges compatible or Bridges friendly or whatever you want to call it. Next week, the IGC Bureau will be meeting to consider parameters, options, and key issues for the future strategy. as a result of which a draft strategy will be developed, which will be circulated to member states for their written comments at the end of June. And that consultation period will run until probably the middle of October. We haven't decided on the exact date yet. And then the Intergovernmental Council, as I mentioned earlier, will meet again at the beginning of December. So there are, I think, a couple of important windows here. First window, following up on this meeting of the General Assembly, please feel free to communicate your thoughts, even if you don't really know the context, and even if you haven't had a draft to react to, on what role you think bridges should have within MOST. Substantively, not so much on institutional matters, of course. The kinds of things we've just been discussing about the importance of the humanities, transdisciplinarity, context, and everything else. And we will take note of those inputs and build them into the first draft of the strategy. Secondly, there will be an opportunity, obviously the consultation, the written consultation process in a purely statutory sense is for the member states of UNESCO. But we will also reach out to our partners. And the Bridges membership is now a partner. Many of the institutions, of course, will also be consulted for other reasons through other channels like CIPSH and ISC. But the Bridges collectivity will have the opportunity to make observations. Of course, you don't sit at the same level as the member states of UNESCO, but you will have that opportunity, and we will take careful note of your feedback on how you think the strategy, how you think Bridges can contribute to the strategy, and how you think the strategy needs to accommodate the objectives and dynamics and specific features of Bridges. So yes, absolutely. And once the executive committee is formally established, we haven't discussed that yet, it comes a bit later this afternoon, the institutional issues, the MOST Intergovernmental Council will have an ex officio seat on the executive committee of Bridges. So there will be a permanent dialogue within Bridges between the intergovernmental community of MOST and the Bridges membership. And that was designed deliberately to ensure that that interface is a living interface, including an interface of dialogue, and not a purely static interface of control and report. So yes, definitely, please do. We want to listen to you on that.
Thank you very much. That's very hopeful and very encouraging.
Thank you, Petra.
Margaret, I noticed that Benno has his hand up, I think, and I saw before that Paul maybe did as well. I'd like to suggest that we end this session at past, which is 5 minutes later than schedule, but we began 5 minutes later than schedule as well. And we can end the next session at 4 o'clock promptly, which still gives the same amount of time for the next session. Thanks.
Right, so that's 3 more people. We have Benno first, maybe?
Yeah, very shortly. I mean, I think if Bridges can really help to make the bridge between UNESCO and the national funding agency, that will be really very helpful. I was working, I think one of the problems of the humanities is that they are not very well positioned in the funding, in the national funding agencies throughout Europe. I mean, you have the bio, geo, and engineering parts, the natural sciences, and then also the social sciences, they're very imitating the natural sciences. But after that, positions are very weak. I was trying for 8 years in the European Research Council for the highest funding level to have an influence on changing that, but it's nearly impossible because on the ground, the humanities are too weakly positioned to have an impact on the changing of research strategies and research programs. So that would be, in my view, the most important, one of the very important points, that Bridges could strengthen the position of the humanities in the funding schemes, probably to intergovernmental agreements or through MOST or whatever the possibilities are. I'm not familiar with all these mechanisms, but politically, that would probably be the most important job that Bridges could do.
Thank you, Benno. Paul, was another?
No, I'll pass. Thank you.
You're going to pass. All right. Luis has a hand up.
No, sorry, I forgot to take it off. I already spoke too much. No need for more.
Well, some of the other names that I noticed in the chat were Tuya. Is Tuya still there?
I'm here. I'm fine, thank you.
Did you have a question you wanted to share with the group?
No, mostly I agree, but I have some more specific issues I would like to raise, but maybe in another context. Thank you.
Good. I myself wonder if Bethany might be interested in commenting on some of the questions that have just come up.
Thank you for that invitation, Margaret. I'm really thinking right now. I'm not ready to comment.
Good.
If I could intervene with a question or an invitation for Marcy, if you're still, are you still there, Marcy?
Yes, I am. Hi, Steve.
Hi. You've been leading some really, I think, groundbreaking work in bringing cultural heritage into an interface together with UNESCO and the IPCC on behalf of ICOMOS. And I'm curious to know if you have any ideas about how bridges could be helpful in the kind of bridge building context that you yourself and your colleagues have been doing within ICOMOS with the IPCC.
Thanks, Steve. I do have some thoughts, and these were swirling in my head before, but I didn't condense them down into a thought. So something that I have seen, and for everyone's knowledge, so I'm an archaeologist and by training, and one of the continual struggles that I have seen in bringing particularly archaeology, all of heritage broadly, but particularly archaeology, into the climate sphere is finding that nexus of how do we make centuries and millennia of human experience relevant to modern day policy? How do we actually connect those pieces? And I think yesterday we heard Tom McGovern talk about his amazing work in Greenland, which I have just been awed by for years and years. And the arc of that research is tremendous. The technical expertise that he has brought together is incredible. What I have seen is in the government spaces that I have been in, is that we've actually struggled to actually figure out how to use it. Our understanding that the Greenland Vikings tried to adapt to their changing environment, but ultimately didn't make it. It's a profound finding, but it's hard to take action on that now. And one of the directions that I have seen and what I found from, I'd say, my anecdotal experience in government circles is what's useful is not what archaeology so much what it finds out, but how it asks questions. And it's actually the archaeological way of thinking that can take some of our modern problems and start to pull them apart. And one of the things I've been trying to figure out is how do I take the incredible work that Tom McGovern and his team have done, and how do we look at that as in terms of a sort of an arc of question asking and start to align that with modern questions. And with respect to bridges, one of the pieces that we initially tried to make happen for our IPCC project, we called it, I was calling it a climate heritage dialogues, and it was to bring together people from the heritage space and from the non-heritage climate space and start to say, what are the questions that each group is asking? How do we actually phrase the questions that we see? How do we bring our information together around them? Some colleagues in China offered to fund this, and it was going to happen in March of 2020. And for reasons I don't need to explain, that didn't happen. But that idea, I think, is still very useful of actually trying to align questions and understanding the ways in which different fields are asking their questions, because I think we have ultimately similar objectives, but the ways in which the questions are actually phrased and answered, and I'm saying again from archaeology, the ways in which archaeological questions are asked and answered that output doesn't line up well to actually use it in other spheres. And so if we can start to find a way to find dialogue between humanities and social science questions and some of the ways in which other policy spheres and the natural science spheres ask and answer their questions, that might be a way of bringing us more closely together. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcy.
I see that we've got hands up from Tom McGovern and Louise. So
let's allow Tom McGovern to accept the praise he's just been given.
Well, I think it's great, and it's almost embarrassing, and I want to make sure everyone realizes it's not me, it is a team. And that's the whole point, is that we bring together people from a wide spectrum. We all work together, different cultures, different funding agencies, and that comes in very handy when you get turned down by NSF and perhaps a EU colleague gets funded and we all manage to go forward. So that's the reason to collaborate right there. The other thing I'd like to sort of flag up here is in interacting with people who are not that interested in the past themselves, but are trying to be modern resource managers. One of the things we've been able to do is try to engage almost on 3 levels. The most basic level is we have information you need and you cannot get from any other place. George Hembrecht, who's one of my colleagues who may be on the list today, has just gotten a nice NSF grant to work on cod and other species in Iceland, the central North Atlantic, going back to the Viking Age and beyond, looking at the data we can provide on fish stocks and also people talking about fish stocks and thinking about fishing. And this is sort of a contribution which the fisheries managers actually are right now very interested in. The Oceans Pass Initiative, Paul Holm and company have been tremendously successful in making the connection between fisheries managers, hard science people, people actually trying to deal with resources and our records of the past, not just archaeology. So that's one level. The other level is trying to pry open what our comrades often talk about is the black box of culture. You know, how many times have we been told we live in a black box, you know, which is inexplicable to people who are modelers and you know, scenario builders. So things like, okay, what are the rules which have allowed communities like Megan Hicks's people from central Iceland to successfully manage migratory bird populations on the millennial scale? How did they do it? We know they did it archaeologically, but what were the actual rules? And for that, of course, you have to get into talking to people. Locally, you have to find out local environmental knowledge. So that's another level, opening up that black box. And the third level, of course, is the highest level, which we like, which is telling our stories of these long-term human ecodynamics experiments, the past, as Carol Crumley has called them. And that's tons of fun. But as Marcy's saying, sometimes that's the hardest one to sell because people look at you in the eye and say, oh, okay, Vikings in the North, too bad, sorry, it's a terrible story, how tragic, but it has nothing to do with us. So that's your hardest sell. It's what we like to do because it's where we get our rewards. But I think we shouldn't ignore the lower level issues of opening up those black boxes. You know, what's inside that cultural content? And also on the very basic knowledge level, we have information you need. You know, on the very basic level, if you don't have this information, you will not do a good job of constructing scenarios for the future. And of course, they're all into scenario building. And one of the things that they have been told repeatedly is a fatal thing for scenario building is to constrain the range of visions that go into the scenario. The scenarios are built entirely by, you know, white male economists. They will not reflect reality. So they know that. And the question is, how can we exploit that? How can we get ourselves into that? Okay, that's me. Thank you. And thanks, Marcy.
Thank you, Tom. If I may interject before I call on Luis, you've reminded me that one of my own questions has been, how does gender fit into our program? How does gender affect the different kinds of questions that we ask as scholars and investigators? Luis?
If I could just interject for a second, we're actually out of time with the session, but Luis is the chair of the next session. So as he can exercise the chair's prerogative, maybe in beginning that one with a transitional comment or question.
Yeah, there's no need for me to say anything at this stage. I think we're okay with Tom. So,
many thanks to you all.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. The floor is yours now, Luis, for
Okay.
leading a discussion for the next 25 minutes on looking ahead. Where does Bridges go from here and how does it get there?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. We start looking ahead by looking into the past, because this was the question. My observation was actually not so important, but it is interesting to observe the number of archaeologists or archaeology-related people in the process of Bridges. And I think the reason for that, it's not because archaeology is a better discipline than the others. It's because the business of being an archaeologist is itself interdisciplinary. For an archaeology, it doesn't make sense in the end, this divide. And so this was my comment. And I fully agree that asking the questions and looking, because then there is an element in looking into the past, because we are now looking into the future. But of course, the humanities, to a large extent, they bring into the future and into the present the past. What is important in the past, apart from storytelling? And storytelling is nice, but as Tom said, and Marta and so on, it's people will not take action necessarily based on that. But when we look into the past, we don't simply describe anecdotes. We also try to make an interpretation, and we find, for example, recurrences, we find patterns of behavior. We can therefore help anticipating some elements that might occur if other elements do occur. And this is an important component for predicting potential behavior, not just to anticipate completely the future, because this is impossible, but to actually have a sense of what is possible or not, and how our societies have dealt in the past with these issues. One example to say about this, we have in our mindset that the one basic principle of democracy, which is the division of power between executive legislation and the law system, is an invention of Montesquieu and Enlightenment. Of course, it is in the sense of the scholarly tradition, but this is a very, very old way of human societies to perform. It was combined with generations, and any anthropologist knows this. We study this, and therefore Montesquieu was still very bright in designing this system for big societies. But this is the type of things that we can bring into society. But my role here is not to talk, is to ask people not to talk that much, and I can't give the bad examples. So I would invite those of you who would like to start by saying, how do you look into the future? I would say this point is of course a very open question, because it is the future of Bridges. We have had some questions a few minutes before about that, on our role. But I would like you also to look at the next steps, okay? Not only the future in vague terms, but what should we do in the next 1, 2, 3 years? Please, who wishes to take the floor?
Paul has his hand up.
Yes, Paul.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm jumping into the beginning of the queue because I have to get off this call in about 30 minutes and I won't be able to stay for the next session. I did want to have a reflection on how one thinks about the future. And the book that has most influenced me in this last year is a science fiction book about climate change by Kim Stanley Robinson. It's called The Ministry of the Future. So indulge me to set the context up over here. The book is very hopeful that humanity is going to come out of climate change and it is going to find its path and do all the regenerative activities that Bridges is imagining for itself. However, the turning point in moving towards a sustainable future comes out of 3 eco-terrorist incidents. One is a bombing of 60 planes that makes the aviation industry go solar. The second is a bombing of a few ships that makes the ship transportation go solar and renewable. And the third is a eco-terrorist incident that poisons the cattle meat in a way that doesn't negatively influence the cattle, but kills the people who eat the cattle. That makes the world go vegetarian. To get to these kind of transformative moments, there is a discourse that is essential, a discourse that allows us to see that violence is going to be coming on board, and we need a way of analyzing it that minimizes the impacts of those violence. And I think what social sciences and humanities have been doing for a very long time is postponing violence without really looking to transform into a more positive society. What I'd like to see happen with Bridges is an influence on the social sciences and humanities that allows it to be radical enough to anticipate what the consequences of climate and non-sustainability action, the violence that's coming out of it. And this violence is not in the future, as you all know, it is already happening in many parts of the world. But what can we do to not just contain the violence and postpone it, but perhaps right-size it so that transformations get triggered? There is a lot to be unpacked in this book. I recommend it to all of you because it was recommended to me by the natural scientist leading the National Academy of Science recent summit on sustainability sciences as something that impressed the natural sciences. And by the end of the conference, I had the woman who was heading the social sciences elements of the conference also recommend it. So it comes highly recommended from both sides, and it gives us a way of looking into the future and planning for the future that might be helpful for Bridges. But thank you very much for all the interventions and comments. I really enjoyed the conference, and I look forward to continuing as time allows. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. You raised something which is very important. It is important also in the strategy for Bridges to follow. I see this one dimension is precisely the explanation of the potential consequences of major environmental ecosystemic changes, whichever the direction is in different moments in history. And therefore building an explanatory set of approaches and a narrative in relation to that. I would ask here one question because I'm not so convinced, to be very honest. I know I'm the moderator, so I will ask a question. I will not say I'm not that convinced that changing the narratives at the level we are intervening traditionally and the level of UNESCO will change that much, because in a sense, I think many people have already understood that they don't take action, but they have understood the consequences of the situation. Look at Central Asia, look at the failed states, look at growing violence, as Paul said. On the other hand, what is not visible is the practice of transformative processes. And I think this is an important issue because we are small, Bridges is small, and we need to, we don't need to close doors. I think there is room for everything. But if we want to prioritize, should we prioritize in addressing a set of principles and a narrative around those, or the principles we already have, or should we primarily look for ongoing experiences and render them visible to demonstrate not the potential negative impacts of what's happening, but the potential positive aspects of other types of actions? It's a question for whoever wishes to take the floor. please say who wants to take the floor. Paul is still with his hand, but I think it's because he forgot to take it off. If no one intervenes, it tells me about two things. One is that we don't see any future. And the other one is that we will finish before time. Elizabeth, please. Thank you. No, you need to unmute yourself, Elizabeth. We can't hear you.
So sorry, I'm sorry. Yeah. I've been listening very carefully to everything that has been said until now, and an idea keeps pumping in my head, probably because I'm too many years belonging to a structure like UNESCO at a national commission, and always seeing how different programs at UNESCO put it in paper that they will work together, but then in the end, in practice, they don't. And however, in this last years, with a program that has been approved by member states, something has happened, and I think it's very interesting. When talking, for instance, about the International Geoscience and Geoparks program, one of the main pillars of these territories, UNESCO designated territories, is the pillar of culture. It's also the importance given to indigenous people and their knowledge, and the work that all of us should do with those local communities, and about culture and diversity in terms of culture and respect for that diversity. And although the main focus started by geological heritage, one thing is for sure, we all understood the importance of culture and how it influenced not only just geology, but also where people live and how they understand nature that surrounds them. The names that they give to the volcanoes, in terms of gender, they give female names and male names to volcanoes to explain the geology. For instance, in Peru, it's a way to explain Pachamama or Gaia, Mother Earth. So it's an interpretation of the local communities. And we have been struggling to point out that it's not just important to have the scientific point of view, but also the point of view of the local communities and the way they tell the stories throughout generations, the way they see nature and the way it has evolved, and how the people itself are in the center, but everything that it surrounds, which is Pachamama, which is Mother Earth, is what we really must respect, and to create again those bonds with Mother Nature. So what I'm trying to tell is that one of the things that I truly think that it would be very interesting was to see bridges creating also a partnership with the Global Geoparks Network, for instance, to see people coming to the conference, to the sessions. Now it's webinars, but anyway, hopefully we will have again our conference every year, and having people coming from different levels, such as humanities, such as arts, because we have a lack of people, although we are always struggling and asking to have multidisciplinary teams in the UNESCO Global Geoparks to include this type of people, professionals, researchers working in these fields, such as archaeology, but not just archaeology, many other sciences that are required to understand the bonds that are between people, a person, and nature. So one thing, and looking ahead, is how to strengthen, how to have a strong consortium such as this one, has bridges, and recognized by, for instance, UNESCO designated sites and other UNESCO programs, not just MOST. And enabling.
Yes,
yes, I'm going to
ask you
finish.
Shorten because we have only 15 minutes.
Yes, I'm going to finish. Just to say, how can we also, as national commissions, help to create the trust that has already been mentioned about bridges and about what it offers to all these type of programs, all these type of designated UNESCO sites.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Elizabeth. Sorry for cutting this.
No,
but,
I understand. Thank
I'm
you
also.
also.
I'm a bit authoritarian, as Stephen in a more elegant way said before. So Benno, I think you have raised your hand, yeah?
Yes, thank you very much, Luis. It's along the line of Elizabeth's intervention a little bit. As you know, we established the Jena Declaration, and I think the Jena Declaration is very close to what the Bridges is aiming for. And I think what the humanities, the strengths of the humanities, I was talking before about the weakness of the humanities, the strengths of the humanities is that they have so many people working on the ground, have a training by the humanities, they have a degree in the humanities, in libraries, in many, many other places. And if you look at all the positions that are taken by people with a humanities background, if we are able to mobilize them for a movement from the bottom up, I think most of UNESCO and UN programs, as just indicated also by Elizabeth, have a too strong top-down logic. And the top-down logic has as an implication ignoring the cultural differences. And without respecting the cultural differences, we'll never able to mobilize people on the broad front to engage for sustainability issues in culturally different pathways towards global sustainability. And this is what Bridges and CIPSH, together with UNESCO, should put really on top of the agenda of international sustainability policy programs. And with that, we could have a forum to place other projects, and their Bridges could be the how should I say, the boost for this kind of projects with intergovernmental negotiations to put it on the agenda, like the MAP program has been put on the agenda for the natural sciences, also mobilizing people from the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you, Luis. There's one something else that I'm involved in that I realized I would be remiss if I didn't mention it for the Bridges Coalition, to let you know. In addition to my work with UNESCO-MOST, I also work with a small nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that provides research and procedural support to members and committees of US Congress. I am their point person for climate change, which means, and my role is to reach out across the climate community to find research that is not yet published, major research that is not yet published. And then I work to bring together hearings and briefings that happen when that research is published. Going back to my original piece on language that started today, it is fascinating to see what research rises to the level of getting the interest of Congress and what does not. And usually things about the big impacts still get more attention than the solutions, even though what solutions are what they need. But I do have this role. So I wanted to just let everyone on this call know that. And so if there are publications and pieces coming out, I will do my best to share them forward or to give feedback on what might go forward. But connected to that, and I don't know if this is appropriate for Bridges, but I again wanted to mention it because I know policy and agendas have come up in the conversation. What brought me to Washington, D.C. was a fellowship program that embeds scientists in the US government and with Congress. And that is how I got to be in the rooms where discussions are being held, is through that fellowship. The year that I started, there were 180 fellows. 3 of them were social scientists, including me. So social scientists is not overrepresented. I am hearing that more and more agencies are asking for social scientists. I think there are some other programs like this around the world. That would be another thing to investigate, but getting more people who are literate and conversant with social science and humanities into those rooms where those discussions are happening could not be more important. Because what I also know from Congress is so many of those staff, they are thoughtful, they are asking good questions, but they don't have time to read, or they don't have time to read very much.
Absolutely.
So the best things we can put out, it's not getting all the way through. We need to get more people in the rooms where those discussions are happening.
Thank you, Marta. I think you made very important points, which we often forget. When we talk with other people, they don't have the time. Well, our job is to read and write to a large extent. They have other jobs and they have to do other things. So we have to build this bridge. Thomas and Falk have asked Nuno. We are getting to the end, so I will ask each one of you to keep it as short as possible so that everyone takes the floor.
Okay, thank you, Luis. I wanted to continue on where Benno and Marcy started. And I think there's always a temptation with a big network like Bridges to aim at influencing policy, influencing national governments and so on. But there is opportunity at the very opposite end of the scale. And I know, Luis, you've worked with communities, and it's so rewarding, and especially for us academics who rarely see tangible results of our work. And I think if we could connect to communities and think a little more of what kind of resources we can offer them, that would be really fruitful, and we can change public opinion from the bottom up about social science. And there are some really obvious partners like Ecoli, their Communities for the Future project is fantastic. I'm sure they'd love to have science input, social science input and humanities input. If we found a way to, refer the right experts to their myriad needs or the needs of their members.
Thank you, Thomas. It's a very, very important point as well. And as you know, I am very close to your opinion. Falk, please. Falk, are you there? If not, Nuno.
Well, I would just like to.
Sorry. Yes, I'm here. Sorry.
Let Nuno finish now, and then I will give you the floor. Okay. Please.
Thank you.
So very quickly, just to build on what Thomas was saying and a little bit to expand what Paul Srivastava was saying yesterday. I think that the role of Bridges, one of the roles of Bridges is going to the small communities and thinking about the role that we have in humanities, and I'm speaking for management, which is probably not humanities as everybody understands it, okay, but it's the lack of legitimacy that we have to speak, for instance, within our own organizations, within our own universities, to advance research, transdisciplinary research, for instance, to address some important issues. So Bridges could give us the legitimacy and the advocacy tools to advance the agendas within our own institutions, so helping to advance this transdisciplinary research. That's all that I wanted to say.
Thank you. Again, an important point. Paul?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to bring a general point across, but I think is important. And this is that, okay, we're generally talking about where does Bridges go from here? And the indigenous point of view or standpoint is basically that in order to move forward, we have to look back as well. Where do we come from? And this doesn't just mean where does Bridges come from? We have talked about that. But where do as they were saying, the principles of life itself come from? How do things, how is nature organized? How do people relate to that? And so for them, the question is basically to recover that, to go back to that, to understand this in order to guide where we go. And I see that mainly in these kind of spaces. We're asking, how should we do things? We're asking questions all the time. For the Kogi, in this case, they don't have questions as such. They know how to take care of things. They say they've always done that. The question is rather, if at all, is to how to cooperate to continue enacting this. And so I think that it's worthwhile to take that into consideration, because in this way, or that will also get us closer to revise or to think about the concepts that guide the discussion, such as sustainability or nature. What does that all mean? Are we talking about the same thing, etc.? And so I just wanted to bring that across. Thank you.
Thank you, Volker. Again, it's an important point. And you were saying in the beginning of your intervention that the Kogi would say we have to look back. And I was thinking, okay, this is also what humanities people say. So the point is that many of us will have slightly different approaches to the issue, right? How to phrase the questions, how do we understand? For example, many of you know that I don't think we are actually experiencing climatic changes, but I'm very skeptical about the real weight of humans in that. But it doesn't matter, because in practice we have the changes and we have to deal with them. We don't need to find agreement on everything. We have to find agreement, as I think we already did, on one hand, the major societal challenges, on the other hand, on the need to turn the table upside down. Now, the way to turn the table upside down, as that has been said here, are we strong enough to make dramatic changes in international and national policies now? We are not. We can have an influence. We will be heard. But what has been said here about decision makers not having time to lead, it's a fact. It's not a fact in the US, it's a fact a little bit everywhere. Sometimes it's a fact in the universities. The rectors, the deans don't have time to read anything. And this is the disaster of our society. And part of the disaster is, I think, that we are always looking at the emergency of doing something and of finding a solution for the last headache we have. But when I hear folk talking about the COVID, it's a little bit like I hear friends, for instance, in India or in China, who don't think that much in that line. They would focus not so much in the problems and the solutions, although of course they look for that, but on the processes. And I think what brings us together is the processes. When we discussed the origins of bridges, we talked about site-based. I even remember very well in Paris a discussion with John, because John started with this argument of the site, but what is a site? And I think we got an interesting understanding of that. And this meets what Thomas was saying. We have in the planet a tremendous number of good examples to look at. It's when we have demonstrated that bridges could do something different, it was not so difficult for us to come with examples. And if we do this in an organized way, we will allow the different understandings to express. We don't need everyone to think exactly like each one of us, and we don't need all of us to agree on everything. But if we create this framework, we can change and turn the table around, because the problem is that each context-based approach or solution, if you wish, will be eventually effective there, but not necessarily transferable to another place. Sometimes people ask me, why wouldn't you come and do what has been done in Nassau somewhere else? And my answer is always, what we did in Nassau cannot be done everywhere. It was studied, it was discussed with the community for over 1 year, and it is completely all the time rethought. So that specific case is not transferable. as the specific case of the Kogi is not transferable, and so on and so forth. But the methodology and the process can. This is the point. We have a methodology which is inclusive. We have tools that are very, very similar. To our surprise, we could think, how come so different and disparate initiatives are in the end so similar? The reason is because they work. We are comparing context and examples that work. So this shows that some contributions we can bring. And I think that the various observations in this debate, although they might seem different, I think they converge in this direction. And then, of course, it will be a matter we still have to discuss further and to take decisions within bridges, not today, but we have on how we will, what will we prioritize. I would personally, this is not even such, I would stand very close to Thomas. I think if we can act in communities and help transformation in those communities, this will have a butterfly effect. And this is, as some of you know, the strategy in Mação, and it pays. But I'm not saying we have to do only this. We have also to be attentive to the opportunities. In the European Humanities Conference, we had the purpose of doing an outcome document, which I've put on the chat a few minutes ago. But once, at some stage, we had a meeting, John was there, with the Portuguese Minister of Higher Education. And he said this very simply. He said, okay, you have lots of proposals, but why don't you choose one that you think can be transformative, and then we can try to take it as the Declaration of Lisbon as part of the Portuguese presidency of the European Union. And of course, we would be stupid saying, oh no, we don't care because all we care about is the communities here and there. I still think that work in the communities is much more important than the Declaration of Lisbon, to be very honest. But having said that, if the Lisbon Declaration is enforced, in 5 or 10 years' time, all people educated in the world in any university will know, if it's an engineer, the basics of philosophy, if it's an historian, the basics of mathematics and science. And this will be tremendous. So I think the conclusion of this debate, if I may to say this before ending to Stephen again, is I think we had important contributions. I saw no contradiction among them. And the only thing we still have to discuss on the methodology of priorities for bridges, keeping all the doors open. Stephen, I give you the floor back.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Luis. And I'm gonna, we're 5 minutes behind schedule, and I'm gonna make us 10 minutes behind schedule because we've gone for almost 2 hours, and I think we need a 5-minute break. So I'm gonna ask, please, that we take 5 minutes now, and we begin the next session at 4, okay?